we weren't hippies by any stretch of the imagination. It was much more like freaks is what we called ourselves. And it was sort of a coming together of all the sort of misfits and malcontents and juvenile delinquents in Baltimore that had sort of artistic potentials. And we all found each other. And our hangouts, two hangouts, were the Hollywood Bakery, which is where a group of people from Maryland Institute, including Vince Peranio, had started a little commune. They were basically all living together. They were painting there as well. They had painting studios. It was beautifully decorated, old Victorian kind of, the style that Vince and the Maryland Institute kids sort of put together. Everybody shopped in thrift stores and used furniture places, and they just really made a magical place there. They had parties. We ate there all the time. And people were pulled into this group at the Hollywood Bakery, and then right next door to the Hollywood Bakery was Pete's Hotel. It was sort of a confluence of three groups, I'd say. The John Waters movie crowd, which included Van and Mink and Divine and so on. And they had just made Hagen a black leather jacket, I think. And we knew about John because he had put posters up all over town on telephone poles and advertising, the run of his movies, which were they truly were underground movies because he showed them in basements. And generally like in church basements. So we knew of him, and it was the confluence of that group and a group of people from Johns Hopkins University, undergraduates that were sort of in literature, studying literature there, and another group from the Maryland Institute, which was the Hollywood Bakery crew. And then other sort of people heard about us or knew from friends of friends and started coming to the Hollywood Bakery and coming to Pete's Hotel and hanging out with each other. And all of a sudden, all these kindred spirits sort of rolled together. And that's where I believe the first movie that John made after meeting all those people was Mondo Trasho. And I know Jim Thompson was in it, for instance. He's an old bakery guy. And Vince production designed it, and so on. And so it's kind of, a lot of people bouncing off each other. I remember the first day I met John at the Hollywood Bakery. John was sort of sitting in a big armchair, like royalty, and he had really long, greasy, black hair, and he had these wraparound sort of electric yellow sunglasses. He was really super skinny. I think he was wearing bell bottoms, and I think they were striped bell bottoms. And he was a really impressive looking guy. He looked like a praying mantis, basically. And sort of the whole group hit it off. And, they went on to make movies every couple of years.
Malcolm Soul was my first star. I mean, she was the most influential woman on me. She was sort of the Kiki of Baltimore. She was in Roman Candles and Eat Your Makeup, of my two movies that are certainly not shown today. She was the star of them. Even Divine was in awe of Malcolm Soul. She died when she was about 27 of old age, and she was a great, great influence on all our lives when we were young. She was a great lady and one of the most eccentric people I've ever met to this day. A beatnik princess.
She was amazing in the fact that as far as style and fashion and eccentricity, all wrapped into one thing, this was one fabulous human being. I mean, the woman ate chalk, for God's sakes. White chalk. She ate white. That was one of the things she liked to do. She drank Fresca incessantly. She smoked Salems incessantly, and she ate chalk periodically.
She scared the hell out of me. I was really young when I met Malcolm.
What was
She
like?
scared me. I don't know why she scared me. She scared me.
What
Because she
really?
was so powerful.
Really?
Her presence was very powerful.
What was
I
driving
was
that?
17 years old, and here I am drinking and snorting poppers with Malcolm and Divine.
First time I met Malcolm Soul, the first time I saw her actually was at a major Baltimore event that was sort of very much society doyens and DAR types, and very much then put on by them, called the Flower Mart in Baltimore, Maryland. And it was a yearly event that was sort of a rite of spring that I can remember going to with my mother every year since I was 3 years old. And then it became, as times changed, I think with that whole beatnik movement, it became like the horsey set, and then a beatnik set, poets, etc., that kind of thing, and school kids, it became, and that was the first place I saw her, and I remember thinking, oh my God, who is this woman? She's amazing.
What was it about her that struck you first? Did she dress more?
Jesus, the way she looked. What do you mean, what was it like? I mean, you have to remember back. In the, like 1963 or 4, you weren't even probably around. However, if people do remember back, that was a different era than somebody who wore white rice powder, drew basically a star, but it was an asterisk sort of thing on her face with extreme ballet Swan Lake makeup and hair redder than mine. That was not the look. Plus, she wore vintage clothing at the time, which nobody did. Nobody did it. She was amazing.
What was the story I heard about her also with wearing blue and blue makeup?
It was, I think it was green, basically. It was one time she just whipped out of the house, I think to go pick a prescription up, with her face totally done in green, like sort of, it was a green theatrical powder. It was mixed in with, was the clown white, basically. And that was just a look she decided to do, you know, because that was what you did. You know, in order to go out, it wasn't walking out the door. There was no au naturel here. This was putting on Swan Lake makeup every day, major eyelashes. You know, it was drag is what it was. I mean, if you had to be a female drag queen, that's what it was. This was what she looked like at the Flower Mart. This is what she wore to that Flower Mart. It's exactly, and that dress was magenta. I remember the top layer chiffon was.
She often thought of herself as some sort of a otherworldly witch or something like that. Of course, which she really wasn't of another world, but she sort of had that ephemeral kind of character that in some way was anti-culture, but in other aspects it was childishly appealing.
She worked in a very much of a jazz slash beatnik. Didn't advertise itself as that, but that's what it was. Bohemian type bar called Marduk's that was in Baltimore that was probably the most fabulous bar that ever was on the East Coast.
This was the kind of bar you might, in the 60s, you might find in New York, but you wouldn't find it in Baltimore. So it's sort of, it was sort of an avant-garde, ahead of its time.
So we kind of would go under the guise to hear the jazz to Marduk's. I had fake ID, which seems to be a big deal these days, and John didn't. John, we would have to wait till Morris left, and then Malcolm would let him come in the back door. So he would hang out in the alley that we called the Alley A-Go-Go, basically. And when Morris, who owned the club, left, we snuck him in.
What about the, let's see, John said it was sort of not a movie he intended to make, it was more a publicity stunt. The title just went out of my head.
Dorothy the Kansas City Pothead?
Yeah.
Well, he was thinking about making it at the time, and we went as far as we could go with it, and then I really forget what happened. But she was playing the witch, and I was playing Dorothy. Imagine. This was a scene from Dorothy the Kansas City Pothead. That would be Malcolm. And she wore this a lot around town, actually. And this is, she didn't necessarily wear it with that, and this is the front. It must have been Christmas time around there, on the street where she literally lived, as they say in the song. She is basically a Bohemian. That was the nationality, Czechoslovakia, Bohemia. That's where her family was from, that part of the world. Her mother was born American, but everybody else had been born in those countries. And this was her mother in the house that she grew up in. I mean, she really adored her mother. And her mother, who was I remember being older than my mother at the time, very much was supportive of her. This little Czechoslovakian / Bohemian woman, she was an amazing woman, her mother.
That's interesting.
Yeah, very much. I think the father was weird in the fact that he wasn't weird. But I think the mother and the sisters and everybody was weird except the father. I mean, the mother just looked like a little old lady, but the mother definitely was a fabulous woman. Her mother gave her that name. It's spelled Maelcum, as sort of some kind of Bohemian, Czechoslovakian type, that part of the world nickname. And that's where it came from. The Malcolm show was fashioned after a show in Paris. There was a very famous model during the time of Toulouse-Lautrec whose name was Kiki.
Well, I used to give art shows here, and I always liked to think of themes. I was like a curator at a museum. I like to think of something that would generate public interest. And I thought about having all the artists paint the same subject.
So each painter would have Malcolm pose for them and do their painting, portrait, or whatever they decided to do in whatever fashion they decided to do, whether it was an oil painting or it was a pastel or an ink and wash or construction or whatever it was. And there were, I'll bet you, I can't remember this, but I know there were at least 40 artists that did it. I remember one of them, I think it was Earl Hoffman, that was a painter at the time, and I think he painted her as the Mount Vernon Monument, the monument of George Washington. It was just the entire landscape around it and just her standing as tall as the monument. I remember that one very much, and I don't know whatever happened to that painting. And I have 3 of the ink and washes by Marvin Miller, which were small in comparison. Some of these were very, very big canvases, and they were really amazing. It really was terrific to see one subject, a person, painted through the eyes of so many artists. And this is one that when she worked at Marduk's, and might even be Marduk's inside, around the time of the Malcolm show, I think, because her hair is cut. And this is the one. This one this really reminds me very much of her. This is how I remember her. You can see she's a very Slavic face. Her hair was redder than mine. And this is a picture of her with her, this is a series, I don't know who took these. So this was her husband, and it's kind of, I guess, mom and dad at home shots. But believe me, these were whipped out of the vaults. But this is the one that really does remind me. You see that asterisk / star, and that very much Swan Lake.
She was a difficult girl.
In what way?
Well, that's the way those people are.
Yeah. You mean demanding, or?
Not so much demanding, but they have their own agenda.
So as far as being like a problem employee?
Huh?
Problem employee? Is that what you're trying to say?
Well, they're problem people. Like one day she dropped her purse and about 50,000 pills came out. I helped her pick them up.
I knew her for so many years. I never saw her take a drink. And one day I did, and now I knew why she never did.
Well, I think that was, I'm not quite sure, but I think the combination of alcohol and the pills she was taking caused her to lose her life.
Yeah, she ran herself out. I mean, you can't, polish off that kind of booze. She just died, and she just drank herself to death in a very short amount of time. The world was changing. She died during the riots. I can remember trying to get to a funeral home when the city was on fire. So I remember also Divine driving. He had a convertible, and he got cut on the back of the neck at a red light. I mean, it was for people who didn't live through that. And it just was like, not only did she die, but the world went crazy all at one time. It was very, very, very odd, the whole thing. So, I look at it, at least she didn't get old.
Well, I don't think she did anything that was different. It was just that she projected an image that most people don't project.
She was totally invented by herself. To tell you the truth, if she walked down the street without any makeup on, I wouldn't recognize her. Even then, I think. She was always in a mask. It was very, very frightening to a 17-year-old girl from a farm.
How hard do you think it would be now for someone to sort of invent a personality where she's
Oh, it would, I think it would be kind of almost impossible. I mean, when you think that the entire, nationally and internationally, people went crazy about Madonna. Well, that's been done before. And I think for somebody to have that kind of impact visually, and I mean, even the club kids, when that was all going on, it just was so forced. This just came the way, this was just something very unique in a world that was really very dreary at the time. Very dreary.
I remember it was the first of all the terrible deaths of people that were big influences on me.
Vincent, Van, and I were in art college. Vincent and I were painters. We studied painting. And Van was in fashion. There was a fashion department there then. And for some reason, I was just very attracted to gay men, and Van and I would go drinking. We connected. And then I met Divine through Van. And then Vincent was another friend of mine, like a hippie friend of mine. And I used to drink with them down in Fells Point, when Fells Point was nothing but a bunch of hillbillies and Greeks and dykes. All those bars down there were dyke bars, heavy dyke bars, like Johnny Cash dykes. And then I was drinking with Van and Divine and John Waters, and that's how I met John Waters at Divine's house. And through George Figgs. George knew him before I did. And we started hanging out, and I said, come on down to Fells Point. You'll love Fells Point. You got to meet this barmaid, Edith. She's my buddy. You know, and we were like drinking for 15 cents a beer, and it was right next door to the bakery where Vince lived. I lived around the corner with Paul Swift. It was perfect. It was a perfect situation for alcoholics. And John and Divine would come down, and that's how John met Edie and Paul and Vince. So I introduced Vince and John, and they hit it off immediately. And of course, that was when Vince started to work with John. And so, you know, John asked me to do Multiple Maniacs, and I played an insane naked person, which was one of my favorite things. You know, I was an exhibitionist, I was an art model in art school, and John loved it. Where's my players? Remember that line? No, that was in Female Trouble. No, that's in Multiple Maniacs. That's right. God forbid if I get them mixed up. We had fun. We had a lot of fun. Even at first, when I came into it, I believe that we thought John had something. And I believed it then. And for some reason I knew I was a part of something bigger. You know, and Divine was just so incredible, and so incredible a person, you know, and the collaborations that went on were unbelievable. Vincent and John. Vincent was John's eyes. Van was John's costume. He invented Divine's. He invented all of it. He's a brilliant genius. So was Vince. And John, and you know, there was a dynamic, a triad that was made it happen. And you know, it was a time in the 60s when the generation that was up, the cultural generation that was up, the hippie time, was about breaking down the civilization's morals, which were the American dream, and which didn't work. And we were in a position to bring it down, and that's what John does. He makes fun of American society. And he uses real stuff for his energy, like Baltimore. Because it's incredible. The characters here are just, it's unbelievable.